We hear about vaccines every day, but what do we really know about them? In the Vax Matters podcast, we explore all matters related to vaccines. I'm Diane Deaton.
And I'm Dion Guillory. Our newest episode of Vax Matters starts now.
Whether you're a fan of our show already or joining us for the first time, welcome to Vax Matters, a podcast series about vaccines from the Louisiana Office of Public Health. I'm your host, Diane Deaton. Now, I'm not one to brag, but we have an awesome show for you today. And helping me guide the conversation is my equally awesome guest co-host, Dion Guillory.
You're awesome, Diane. You're awesomer. It's not even a word, but that's what you are. But it's always great to be with you, Diane. And you're right. We do have an awesome show today. Our guest is Dr. David Holcombe, one of the regional medical directors for Louisiana's Office of Public Health. He'll be walking us through the top myths about vaccines, and there are quite a few of them. Dr. Holcombe is joining us today from Alexandria in central Louisiana, and those who are from that area know it as Sinla, as the people there like to call it. Welcome, Dr. Holcombe.
I'm glad to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
All right, let's jump right into a myth because we have quite a few of them to get through. Vaccines can give me the virus it's trying to protect me from.
It cannot give you the virus. The technologies use bits and pieces of either the protein, spike protein itself, or a manner to manufacture that. So it's incomplete pieces. And so it is impossible to get COVID from any vaccine.
So our next myth, again, as Dion said, there are so many. It's just kind of incredible where the thinking comes from. But with professionals to sort it out for us, as you are, Doctor, this makes it so much easier for our listeners to have a grasp and an understanding. So this next myth is that specific disease doesn't exist anymore. So as a result, I don't need to get vaccinated.
The rates of COVID have decreased recently. And so the Omicron had this gigantic wave, infected most of Louisiana, and now is coming down. So it has about a 2% positivity rate and lower incidence. I know that doesn't mean much to people, but it's still out there. It's not as prevalent as it used to be, but it's still out there. And there's always the potential, really the certainty of forming new variants. So even if it's really low level in the population, it is still beneficial to get vaccinated because COVID, we're done with COVID, but COVID's not done with us.
Absolutely. And of course, that's what everybody is thinking about, COVID. But let's talk about some of the other diseases like measles, mumps, polio. Don't need the vaccine, not around as much anymore.
They're not around because of vaccination. Vaccination has been one of the greatest triumphs of public health of the 20th century. And so these diseases, people are simply not used to them anymore because they have more or less disappeared from common occurrence. But measles still exists, and it still strikes unvaccinated individuals and causes serious illness. So vaccine-preventable diseases still exist, and the reason for vaccination is still there, and people need to get vaccinated and vaccinate their children.
Speaking of children, there's this next myth. There are harmful substances in the vaccines that are dangerous for me and or my children.
That is a real myth because there are not substances there that will hurt people or their children. This has been propagated by individuals with axes to grind against vaccines in general, but there are really no products in there that are harmful to people. So that is truly a myth.
And then the next one, Doctor, that I think we hear a lot, and especially within the past year and a half, 2 years since COVID has been, of course, everywhere, people talking about it. And that myth is, and this is really incredible, that the government or healthcare system trying to control me, my friends, and those that I love. What do you say about that myth?
Well, it's simply not true. If the government wants to track you, actually, your iPhone can probably track you extremely well, and if you don't, and everyone has one of those. So
Exactly. Yeah.
it's not true. It's no plot. To put a microchip in somebody would require a needle so large that it would barely go in you, and so this is a reflection of fear, of fear of control. And I understand that, but it's simply not justified because this is not some sinister plot to control people.
And that's what we were talking about too, Doctor. You know, it's just that the misinformation. One person says something, and it's like when you're a kid and you play the game of gossip. You know, somebody says one little thing, and then it just explodes from there. And then almost becomes, it's not fact, but it's, have you heard, have you heard, have you heard? You know, you put a magnet up to your arm and it's going to stick to you. And like you said, the government is putting this, they're going to track you. Well, I'll tell you what, the government's tracking me. They're bored because I'm a really dull person. But you know, it's just amazing how these things, again, the myth of misinformation takes on a life of its own.
Yeah, it's all about fear. And in this particular case, it's fear of government control or loss of personal control. And that's a significant emotion to deal with, but it also clouds their judgment as far as vaccines are concerned.
Mm-hmm. This next one has been a big part of a lot of conversations, and people of a particular age who want to do some family planning or anything like that. This one is vaccines can cause infertility, impotence, and or miscarriages.
These are all myths. This is also motivated by misunderstanding and fear. And in younger people, they're very concerned about their fertility and and whether they're impotent or not, of course. And somehow it got mixed up in this vaccine. But the fact is, it doesn't do any of those things. In fact, COVID itself decreases male fertility when males are infected. It's transitory, but it does. So if you want to protect yourself from COVID-related infertility, get the vaccine, because the vaccine does not do that. It does not cause impotence. It does not cause infertility. And pregnant women, are very concerned legitimately about what goes in their bodies. And so I understand there was a lot of reticence about this in the beginning. But what happened is, with accumulating evidence, with the millions of doses that have been given also to pregnant women, they have found that pregnancy is, if you get COVID during pregnancy, your risks are far higher than if you get vaccinated. So getting vaccinated is actually beneficial for pregnancy. It doesn't cause any problems.
And a program like this, Doctor, it helps women, it helps the family. They need due diligence. They need to figure this out and know what is true. And that's what you're talking about, to make sure that these myths don't perpetuate themselves and that they end up harming themselves or their unborn child. So that was such an excellent point to make. And then another myth, as we're going down this list, because as Dion said at the beginning of the program, there are so many of them. There is the myth that vaccines can actually change my DNA.
Now, see, I haven't heard that one, so that one blows my mind.
Yes, I've heard all of these. And I think it's because the technology has some complicated words like mRNA and this messenger RNA, and that's a genetic component. So people extrapolated in their minds that somehow if you gave this genetic component, it actually got into your DNA and polluted it somehow. It doesn't get into the nucleus of the cell where your DNA lives. And so it can't do that. Plus, it's fragments that are introduced that do their thing. They cause your body to produce spike proteins. The spike proteins go out. The antibodies get produced. But that's it. And then it dissolves. So it doesn't stay in your cell at all, and it never gets in the nucleus to be integrated into DNA. This is another myth.
And you mentioned mRNA. And this next myth is touching on that, saying that mRNA technology is brand new, so its effectiveness and safety cannot be trusted.
Well, we heard more of this in the beginning than we're hearing now. And thank heavens we had the technology, because there had been labs that were working on genetic sequencing for decades. I mean, I'm talking about 15 to 20 years. And so when SARS came, there was already an existing technology to clip, to recreate, to sequence, and that allowed us to make a vaccine in a record time. Now, that record time doesn't mean it was dangerous. It just means that the technology was there, ready to produce. And so all these vaccines still went through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies. These are all things that are required by the FDA. So this seemed fast, but in reality, it was all the steps were followed, and it has been a real triumph of science to have produced this vaccine so quickly.
Yeah, and another thing about this is that, another one of those myths is that people say the side effects of the COVID vaccine are unknown and potentially dangerous.
Well, in the beginning, there wasn't a lot known because of phase 3 studies, 30,000 people, Now we have millions of doses. And the side effects associated have been truly trivial. I think they had 2 anaphylactic, people have an allergic reaction, a couple of those. You're talking about almost 5 million doses given in Louisiana alone. So over time, it has become more and more obvious that there are not significant side effects, and this is an extremely safe and effective product.
And Doctor, we're also talking about the fact not only about the vaccine for COVID, but for the other vaccines. In particular, I have friends that their children have had vaccines, and then they're talking about we're so concerned, or they don't have a vaccine because they're concerned about autism. So that is a whole different spectrum when you're talking about another area of vaccination and what to do for your family.
Well, this came up sometime in the past with some totally discredited studies by a British physician who had his license revoked. Then they did large national studies for vaccines in general, and vaccines don't cause autism. It's just not true. But people latch onto this because of underlying fears and anxieties, and that is what you're trying to combat here: those fears and anxieties. Vaccines do not cause autism.
And that's what you were saying, too, especially with just pinpointing that it's fear, that it's emotional responses, not logical ones, Doctor.
And that is true and very difficult to combat, because pumping a bunch of statistics into people who have a visceral fear of vaccines in general, and COVID vaccine in specific, it tends to not register. And you hate to use fear as a motivational factor, but when you can lose your loved ones or even your children to a disease that's vaccine preventable, that should cause fear in people. It's just not a great motivating mechanism.
Yeah. Another one and this is one that we heard early on in the pandemic, is that natural immunity is better and stronger than a vaccine.
That actually also proved to be a myth. It wasn't really known in the very beginning, but as time went on, it became clear that people who have gotten the infection do have some level of natural immunity. Okay, I mean that's their body's done what it's supposed to do, but that immunity wanes quickly. It goes away rather quickly, and it's greatly enhanced by adding vaccination. So vaccination, whether you've gotten the disease or not, is the best way to go.
Yeah, and so that kind of puts to bed, in a way, the thought process of it's better to get it and get it over with. It's better to get the vaccine and get that over with as opposed to getting the disease itself.
Absolutely.
So when you talk about the folks that say, well, I've already had COVID in this particular instance, I really don't need the vaccine, what do you say to that?
Well, they will do well to get the vaccine because for a couple of reasons. And one is that this natural immunity tends to go away rather quickly, and it's highly specific to what you had as far as the infection, whether it was Delta or Mu or whatever. So when you get the vaccine, you enhance antibodies that are more likely to be protective against other variants. And we already saw that in Delta and in Omicron, because people who had been got some natural immunity from Delta were almost completely unprotected from Omicron. So again, these are statistics and watching populations, and one person thinking about their health tends to get hung up on these misconceptions, and they're destructive. Because having been immunized, you were much less likely to get the disease. Not entirely, you could still get it, and you were very much less likely to end up in the hospital.
And I think that's the crux of what so many people consider and think about. Well, I got the vaccine, but I still got sick. I still got COVID, the breakthrough or whatever. But it's kind of like anything, like we were talking the last time with Dr. Welch, you get the shingles vaccine. That doesn't mean you're not going to get shingles. It's just not going to be to the degree that it would have been had you not gotten the vaccine. So that kind of leads into our next myth. Vaccines are ineffective. They're not.
No, I mean, if we're just talking about COVID, being vaccinated mean you were about 15 times less likely to get the disease. You could still get it, but you were less likely. And then you were like 50 times less likely to end up in the hospital or die.
Exactly.
And this has been demonstrated. We watched this play out in the whole nation. And at any one time, 70 to 80% of the people in hospitals and ICUs were unvaccinated. There were a certain group that were vaccinated to end up in the hospital, but they almost always were people with great numbers of underlying diseases and very elderly.
The other myth that, and we also, this is one of those that we heard when the vaccine was first being rolled out, is that there are controversial ingredients in vaccines, especially the COVID vaccines, like animal byproducts. People were talking about that. And so because of that particular myth, they weren't going to get the vaccine.
Well, I think the biggest thing that sort of was a determining factor in all that was the fact that fetal tissues, there was some question that there were fetal tissues in the vaccines. No vaccine contains fetal tissue. Where immortal lines of tissue, and some of these came from cancer patients and stuff, those were used for testing and in at least one vaccine and manufacturing process. So, but there is no fetal tissue of any kind in any vaccine. So that should not be a consideration, although it got a lot of public attention because of certain religious beliefs. But, there is no major religion that said you should not get vaccinated.
We were talking as well, not just beyond the scope of the COVID-19 vaccination, but just about vaccinations for children. And we've been talking, too, about how dangerous or a myth, is it dangerous to give my child multiple vaccinations at one time? What do parents need to know about that?
Well, this has become a trend among young parents, that they will make a request to the physician to stagger the vaccines because they don't want to give them all at once. But actually, there's no evidence that giving multiple vaccines at once actually does any harm. In the beginning of COVID, they weren't quite sure, and so they actually said, well, you should hold off 2 weeks or whatever before, or even longer until you got another vaccine. But as time went on and flu season came in, they said, you may have these two vaccines at the same time. Children have a lot of vaccines, and they're all excellent vaccines, and they all do a wonderful job, and often they're given at the same time. But again, there's no evidence that doing that actually harms a child. Children are very robust, and their
They're
immune
resilient.
systems, yes, and their immune systems are extremely active, and so they take it all in, and they produce all the right antibodies, and they are protected.
And that's why there's a vaccine schedule for children that we've learned about.
Which is what we talked about before. And, you mentioned children, and that's a great segue into this next myth that's saying some populations aren't high risk, and therefore they don't need to be vaccinated because children can't get severely sick with COVID-19. They don't need the vaccine. So, people were throwing that myth around.
Well, first of all, children can get sick, and they can get extremely ill. The multi-inflammatory syndrome actually killed maybe 600 children nationwide. That's not a huge number. It's about twice as many as children who die from the flu every year. So children can get extremely ill, and they can actually die from this disease. It's not in huge numbers. But probably the biggest problem is that unvaccinated children form a reservoir for COVID. And COVID continues to circulate in the unvaccinated population, where it can form variants that are more transmissible, more deadly, and those can go back to their parents or their grandparents, and those can actually do a great deal of harm. So it protects the child, but it also protects people around the children.
Yeah, and then the other thing was, when we saw the different variants and the spikes in new cases and everything, and still when we see the case numbers come out, there's a certain age group, because they consider themselves to be young and healthy, they'll be fine, that they aren't also getting the vaccine.
Well, it's very obvious from looking at, from the vaccine statistics, because when you get up to above 70 group are half of the people who died are in that group. Almost 10,000 people in Louisiana, and there's 16,000 who died. Almost more than half of those were over 70. But those people understand, and almost 90% of that age group is vaccinated, because they know they can die. And you see the same thing with the flu vaccine. And as you go down in the age groups, there is less and less percentage of people that get vaccinated until you get down in the kids' age, which you run into the 10 and 20% vaccination rate, which is really grossly inadequate. So you're absolutely right. The problem is that in the 18 to 29-year-old, where you'll find most of your young parents, if they are not vaccinated, they are unlikely to have their children vaccinated. The biggest predictor of a child vaccination is whether the parents are vaccinated. So having a big bunch of young adults that are not vaccinated, first of all, they can carry the disease and transmit it around. Plus, they tend not to get their children vaccinated. Those are both very bad things.
And that is that perfect segue into the myth that getting vaccinated only affects and impacts me, just one person. That is just a total myth.
Well, everyone now has heard this herd immunity concept. And I mean, what it is if enough people have suffered a disease in a community, then essentially the virus has no place to go. And it's like, having a forest fire, you burn up all the wood and, there can't be a fire anymore. But you've also burned down your forest. So that's that kind of myth. But vaccination is not just a personal choice. It's a community choice, because you are not just affecting yourself, you are affecting the people around you. And for me, that would be a total no-brainer. I help myself, I help my society. But not all people have that mindset. And that's very unfortunate, because with vaccination, we could have saved a lot of grief and misery by having higher vaccination rates.
Yeah, that's the push there, to make sure that more people get vaccinated so that we can have that to where we are protecting everyone in our community.
So many of these myths, it's just incredible that we've gone through, I don't know, probably a dozen or more myths that have just been perpetuated. And they were prominent likely before, during the years of vaccines, doctor, but with COVID-19, boy, it was a wildfire, just exploded. And, we were talking too about the fact of misinformation and people just, did you hear this? Did you hear that? Did you hear, all these other things? So it's just incredible that this continues. We're 2 years now into COVID, and it just still seems like they're out there. And that's why it's so important. And we do thank you for being our guest today to talk about what's happened and where we're going from here. So in the last minutes of our program, is there anything we didn't touch on that you would really like to bring home to our listeners today, Doctor?
Well, I think it needs to be mentioned that this is the first major vaccine in the internet social media age.
Oh, that's a great point.
And so we didn't have these things. In polio, the parents were beating down the doors to get their kids vaccinated because they understood
Indeed.
that this was going to protect their children from iron lungs and paralysis and even death. And so it was a huge societal effort to get everyone vaccinated. And parents were on board, and kids were on board, and everybody's on board. But that was also prior to an age where myths and apprehensions and fear could be propagated through social media. So I'm not saying social media is necessarily a bad thing, but it also is a very it's a very serious tool for misinformation, as we can see in political situations around the world right now. And if you have fear, or you're willing to exploit fear for your own advantage, whatever the advantage that may be, then the terrain is there to do it. And this has been really a fascinating and somewhat depressing sociological phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. And with social media, it's a slippery slope for a lot of people who are looking for information. And unfortunately, they fall down the rabbit hole of misinformation, and they keep clicking link after link after link. And then that grows that fear that so many people have had. Right.
Fear is the real problem here. And as President Roosevelt said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And here, fear itself has been an enemy of vaccination.
Well, Dr. Holcombe, we are so appreciative of you, of your time, of all of your knowledge, and just trying, as Dion said, we don't want people to fall down that rabbit hole.
Right.
We want to give people the facts that this is emotional response that they have when they start thinking about or hearing about these myths. This is not logical. So we are so glad you were able to offer your expertise and hopefully answer questions, comments, concerns some people may have. And to our listeners, we are very, very happy you joined us today. And we do hope you'll tune in for more on our next episode coming soon.